In terms of Re.Climate and the work that we've done within this, we know that households account for about 17% of Canada's emissions. And in provinces like Ontario, that's closer to 30%. And so over the past year, Re.Climate, we worked with Environics and we conducted research looking at how affordability shapes the conversation and shapes Canadians' views on climate policies and household technologies. What we found is that money alone didn't tell the whole story. But people also wanted to know whether or not the programs are fair, can they access them, do the technologies really work, and how do incentives and rebate programs actually help? And so we're really delighted to have Clean Energy Canada here today, who worked with Abacus to look at who is most ready to adopt clean energy technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps. What are the barriers that stand in the way for Canadians, and how we can overcome these barriers. And the results show that Canadians are far more open to these technologies than we might think. So we are joined today by Rachel Doran, who's the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada. She brings nearly 20 years of experience in policy, politics, and law to advance clean energy solutions for Canada's sustainable economy. Prior to joining Clean Energy Canada, Rachel occupied numerous roles in government, serving most recently as a senior special advisor on climate and director of legal affairs to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. She is joined with her colleague, Trevor Melanson, who leads Clean Energy Canada's communications department and has been with the organization for a decade. As part of his role, he oversees Clean Energy Canada's public opinion research around clean energy and climate policy. Trevor has also a decade of experience as an award-winning magazine journalist, and in 2024, he was the recipient of a Clean 50 Emerging Leaders Award. They will be joined as part of the panel by Drew Tozer, who runs the front end of Foundry heat pumps in Toronto. He also is the author of Feel Good Homes, which is a best-selling book that teaches heat pumps and building science in simple terms. It's an easy first step for electrification, putting homeowners on a path to transform average houses into comfortable, healthy, and sustainable homes. And then finally, I'm delighted to say that we'll be joined also by Cara Clairman, who has taken Plug and Drive from an idea to a thriving nonprofit recognized as a leader in the EV space. Cara has more than 30 years of experience working in the environmental and sustainability fields, including 12 years working at Ontario Power Generation, initially as OPG's environmental lawyer, and later in the role of Vice President, Sustainable Development. Prior to joining OPG, Cara spent 5 years practicing environmental law with the Tories law firm. So just in terms of how this will flow, we will have a presentation of the segmentation research that was conducted by Clean Energy Canada. Then we'll open it up to a panel discussion, and then we'll dive into questions. So please, once again, if you have questions, use the chat, or don't use the chat. Use the Q&A function, and we are recording. We will provide the presentation and as well as other materials. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Rachel, to take us away.
Thanks so much, and I'll invite Trevor to share his screen so we can begin our presentation. We will be flying through in the next sort of 25 minutes, a lot of content, so looking forward to digging in deeper as folks have questions. And I will say I'm connecting today from the city of Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and just an important week to remember how grateful I am for where I'm connecting from. So Amber did a great job of kicking us off on households, and maybe I will start by talking a little bit about why this topic was important to us. So, looking back a year ago, we also were kind of thinking, like we're sitting on the edge of 10 years of great climate policy, but maybe even before the downfall of the carbon price or rising public fears about tariffs, it's already clear that like some of this just isn't connecting at a public buy-in place. And also over the course of the past 10 years, there's just been such radical changes in the kind of cost benefit of some of these very tangible technologies at a very local and household level. And we looked at the policy landscape, and while some of these policies that may be complex to access will work for people who are highly motivated, who really want these things, who will do their own research, what about that mass of people who may be interested but kind of need a bit more help, or for it to kind of make sense for them in different ways? So Trevor, I think you can skip along slides here, right to the next one. So I've already acknowledged, like, there's an emissions benefit here, and it goes beyond the 17%. It's not just the provinces that don't have oil and gas where it's 30. It's also, the more we're seeing things like electric vehicles take over broadly globally, the more it's already reducing global oil demand growth. So this is really going to have an impact that resonates. And we're already seeing in advanced economies kind of 60% of clean energy investment come from these really simple things like just buying an electric vehicle or a heat pump. And there's also this kind of magnifier effect in two ways. So every time, somebody is an early adopter of a technology, they're helping build the business case to drive those costs down over time, which is part of what we've seen happen, as the cost of vehicles, kind of continues to get towards that level between traditional fossil fuel and electric. And also, it's just like neighbors. In our study, one of the things we found is, if you've been exposed to a technology by a neighbor or a friend, you are highly more likely to consider it yourself. So this kind of, effect that will really create momentum as individuals really share their experiences with people who are close and who trust them. And finally, getting a bit more complex, but on kind of a grid scale, we often talk about, will the grid be able to handle these things? When in actual fact, it can be a really exciting opportunity for us to think about energy in new ways, and all of these products that are going to be more efficient overall, but which you can also kind of use at different times. And maybe flip the slide here, Trevor. Because if you look at this picture of a future energy smart home, it's going to kind of have the potential to change the ways people produce energy, they store it. You can, use your electric vehicle in this future home to kind of power your home when electricity prices are high. You can use various things to store energy and just use it smartly, also helping just drive down the costs and make things more efficient for people. So I think this is sort of a concept we want to start building, a bridge and explaining to people this is going to be a benefit in their day-to-day lives. And it isn't just kind of for the tech bros, it's for everybody. But that leads into, next slide, please, Trevor. A bit of an assessment of, okay, before we start thinking about how we can improve or who are the people who will be the next group of people to adopt technologies, I thought it's good to set the stage a little bit about what the landscape looks like today. So looking here, we can see the purple circles on our map are all EV adoption. And we have some strong leadership in BC and Quebec, which have had traditional strong policies for EVs. And the only other double digit up in the Yukon, where they continue to prove that EVs work in the cold. But otherwise, our leading provinces, if you look down at the bottom graph, are actually kind of similar to some of the national numbers we're seeing out of places like the UK and France. So Canada not necessarily a leader here, and definitely watching maybe closer what's happening south of the border in the US and their numbers than what we might be seeing in some of these global leaders. Heat pumps all in the white circles. Kind of globally, we're seeing those numbers be a little bit lower, closer to 6%. But some really exciting things happening in the East Coast that I'm sure Drew will talk about in his presentation, where we've seen some policy leadership and maybe traditionally this idea of, if you were heating your home with oil, how much more efficient and low cost is it going to be to adopt a heat pump? So some strong policies there that have supported adoption over time. But now we're talking about, and Trevor, you can flip to the next slide. So a little picture of, where are we sitting at today? And I guess maybe the thing to share is it is helpful to look at the world, because Canada, I think we are not, at the forefront of this technology change. We're a bit of a taker here in some ways, and we can be watching what's happening in other countries and maybe pointing Canadians to, how much change is happening globally. So we're the red line in both of these graphs. On the left, this is compared to European countries. So there's definitely some leaders out there ahead of Canada. And on the right, we see global EV numbers. And so again, Canada's sitting down there closer to the bottom, a little bit tied to the US. And so one of our questions is, how do we help keep that curve going up? And who are the people out there who are going to help us really ensure this continues to happen? So with this background, I think, we really decided last year to focus our research on better understanding, in addition to this actual level of demand, who are these next adopters of technologies, and what can governments, organizations, and companies do to break down the barriers and build momentum? So at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Trevor, who will start talking you through some of our segmentation research.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Yes, I'm joining you from Gibsons, BC on the Sunshine Coast, which of course is the traditional lands of the Squamish people. But I'm very much part of the Seashell Nation community. For anyone who lives on the coast, they're really a big part of the community here, which I very much appreciate, and I'm grateful to live here. So I want to start by talking about the methodology that went into the survey, and it's kind of a two-step process. At first, we did a large survey with a big sample size. So we've got 3,000 people that we surveyed. 1,500 of those people are in Metro Vancouver, and 1,500 of those people are in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. Now, I will say that when you look at the overall results, they are weighted more toward the GTHA, simply because the population is quite a bit higher. But nonetheless, these two metro regions alone cover 27% of Canada's population. And we felt they had a lot in common. They're both high density, they have long commutes, they have large immigrant populations, they're politically similar. But of course, most Canadians do live in and around cities, and I would imagine a lot of the takeaways here would apply in places like Ottawa, Victoria, Halifax, in contrast with rural parts of Canada, which I think would be a separate study. So the high-level results are really quite encouraging. Nearly 6 in 10 are interested in EVs, heat pumps, and having an energy smart home. And among younger folks, so people under 30, that's 7 in 10 for EVs specifically. And among people who live in Metro Vancouver, 82% of people under the age of 30 are inclined to get an electric car as their next vehicle. So I think we lose the plot sometimes when we look at EV interest nationally, which we see as 45%, by the way. That's 45% of Canadians are inclined to go to electric. But the regional and demographic differences are really extreme. So we're really mixing hot and cold when we look at those high-level numbers. And when you zoom in on certain demographics in certain regions, it tells a very different story. So interestingly here, 57% say clean technologies will lower their monthly costs, and 64% say they'll end up cheaper after a decade of ownership. I'll note this is kind of logically backwards, because clean technologies would not be cheaper after a decade of ownership if they weren't cheaper month to month. So the question is whether or not they're breaking even. But I suspect that the reason people are answering the question this way is the latter puts them in a future-oriented frame. They're thinking, and I find in poll questions, whenever people are thinking about 10 years from now, clean energy gets a big bump in, support or anticipation in terms of things taking off. Anyways, but across the board here, all these clean technologies are very popular. So, you see EVs down below are, the most divisive, but it's still not even really close. And we shouldn't let the noise of detractors fool us into thinking, otherwise. Now, I'll note that this is sort of support. So liking something is not the same as intention to adopt those technologies. So, I think more people are obviously going to be in a place to adopt an electric vehicle than rooftop solar panels. But people like rooftop solar panels. And on the flip side, smart thermostats in the number one place, that's an extremely accessible technology that I would think most people could in fact adopt. So let's move on to the next part of this research, which is the segmentation. using a process called latent cross analysis. So basically using characteristics like age, education, gender, carbon footprint, motivation, EV ownership, and others. Abacus ran software that detected patterns in the sample that allowed us to group people into 5 distinct segments. And so let me name them quickly. We've got net zero dads and moms, and I'll talk about why we call them that in a moment. We've got Generation Green, we've got practical families, retired homeowners, and finally, we've got frugal skeptics. 2 of these folks are highly motivated to adopt clean technologies. That's net zero dads and moms and Generation Green. 2 of them are moderately motivated. That's practical families and retired homeowners. And the frugal skeptics are really not motivated at all. A key difference, though, between the net zero dads and moms and Generation Green, our 2 high motivated groups, is that net zero dads and moms on average have more of the means to actually follow through on what they would like to do and adopt these technologies. So let's dig into these segments a little bit here. So net zero dads and moms represent 14% of the population, and they're highly motivated to adopt clean technologies. They're typically younger urban parents with kids in the house. They have higher incomes. Usually they're university educated. They typically work full-time jobs, and most of them commute by car. Now, the term, it was coined by The Economist. It was a story called like The Rise of the Net Zero Dad. And there was this illustration of this middle-aged guy, and I think he was reading a magazine that said Heat Pump Monthly. And it was about this sort of quintessential middle-aged guy who almost is into it as a hobby, whether or not he's even that climate motivated. And we thought it was a pretty funny story. And so we felt that this demographic actually was the most likely to encompass that caricature. And also to reflect the fact that it is a bit weighted on the gender end of the spectrum here. You see 61% of this segment is male and 39% is female. So that's why we called it net zero dads and moms. Now, let's look at a few specifics. So 50% of these folks own an electric vehicle. Almost 9 in 10 know someone who does. All of them are inclined to get an EV. 94% think it's important their next home is energy smart. About 3/4 are interested in getting a heat pump. And almost all of them, again, are motivated to reduce their carbon footprint. The main points of where they get information on clean technologies, social media, friends and family, you're going to see that those often come up with these segments, though not all of them in that order. And as for barriers, I mean, this is the lowest barrier group of this research. But nonetheless, basically everybody cites upfront cost as a barrier to some extent. And everybody has knowledge gaps. There's a lot of basic things that people don't know. For example, just over half the people we surveyed didn't know that heat pumps provide cooling, like the most basic fact. So the next highly motivated group, Generation Green, this is 19% of the population. Again, similar levels of motivation, only a little bit lower. But they're younger, childless, likely unmarried, and most actually rent or live with family. Some of them own, but most rent or live with family. And they're most likely to take transit, bike, walk to work. And only 1 in 4 own an EV. Well, that's quite a bit still, but they're very likely to know someone who does. But nonetheless, because if you look at the second number here, again, almost 100% of them are inclined to get an EV, but only 25% of them have translated that into actually getting an EV versus the first group where it's 50% of the segment. But similarly, yeah, 3/4 know someone who does. Overwhelmingly, they want an energy smart home. They're motivated to lower their carbon footprint. 2/3 want a heat pump. I would say that's a little bit comparatively lower than the interest in EV, and it's not huge, but I suspect the reason for that is that for these folks, the barriers to getting a heat pump may actually be greater than the barrier to getting an EV. Like if you're somebody who, maybe you have a low income, but you already have a house, and you need to replace your gas furnace at some point, the barrier to getting a heat pump isn't that huge. But if you're someone who doesn't own a house, and even if they did own a house, can't imagine being able to afford anything other than a condo, then the barrier to get a heat pump is actually pretty high. So that may be why it's a little bit lower here. Social media, friends and family are where they generally get their information. And as I mentioned, the one barrier that's higher for them is going to be housing cost. Now on to the moderately motivated group. So we've got retired homeowners. This is 30% of the population. They're older, generally retired, empty nesters. They typically own their homes, and many of them own their homes with no mortgage. And are the most likely group to have technological concerns like assumed electrical upgrades. So EV ownership is very low among this group, 6%. Only half know someone with an EV. Half are inclined to get an electric car. It's kind of similar numbers across the board here. Half are motivated to lower their carbon footprint. Heat pumps are a little bit high, like compared to how much everything else drops. Heat pumps interest actually drops the least. So that may be a technology that appeals to the most. And what's different with this group is news outlets are their number one source of information on clean technology, which is great for an organization like Clean Energy Canada, because I feel like that's how we're speaking to people. And on their barriers to adoption, yeah, so housing type is actually less of a barrier, certainly than Generation Green, but infrastructure concerns like having to make electrical upgrades is something that they're more likely to be worried about. On to practical families, the other moderately motivated group. This is 15% of the population. And it's kind of the other side of the coin that would include net zero dads and moms, is it's the sort of a parent age group here. But it's the one that, they're not as keen, they're not quite as, they don't earn quite as much money, and so on and so forth. So they are, again, generally younger parents, kids in the house. They're split between suburban and urban living, housing types, homeowner status. And I'd say they're middle class, some even lower middle class earners, most with just a college or high school education. Now, 9% of them own an EV, so that is higher than the retired homeowners group. Half of them are still inclined to get an electric car, and 60% on heat pumps. But as you'll note their motivation to lower their carbon footprint is quite low. So I find this really interesting because their openness and interest to clean technologies is like the same as the retired homeowners group. And in fact, more of them have actually gotten an EV, but they say that their motivation from a carbon perspective is half. So, it is the case that just because you say you're motivated to do something, that doesn't necessarily translate into actually doing it. Or maybe you think doing it means something else. Because of their age, social media and friends and family are where they mostly get information. And, most of the barriers are moderate barriers for them, including housing type. Finally, frugal skeptics. This is 22% of the population and mostly unmotivated. Generally, they're single, childless, but they're evenly split across ages and genders. They typically have a high school education and or less, and they typically have a lower income. Most of them rent or live with family. None of them own EVs. They usually don't know someone who does. 18% are inclined to get one. Heat pump interest is a little bit higher. You're not motivated to lower their carbon footprint. Social media and news outlets most likely, but again, they're just less likely to get information in the first place. And pretty much everything is a major concern for them. So they're really not accessible, or like to the extent that they're accessible, if there was affordable housing built with heat pumps installed, that would be the kind of way to get them to actually enjoy the benefits of these technologies. But otherwise, these people are largely, I would say, unreachable at the moment. So with that, I will pass it back to Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So we've met our households, but critically, all of us on this call want to know, what can we do to help them make the switch? And so what can public policy and private action do? So Trevor mentioned this as he went through, but the number one issue for everyone across the board was upfront cost. And this is despite the fact that the majority did know you would save money over time. Just in a moment where people are really concerned about day-to-day bills, fitting this into their budget is really critical at that top. And I think it wasn't just the purchase price. Sometimes it was issues for EVs like, will there be battery technology challenges, and will I have to pay for that? Will I need to upgrade the electricity in my home to plug in my EV? So I think there's a number of different things that we can do to address this. One is government incentives, and so those were still very popular across the board with who we polled, and do help address this incentive side piece. But I think maybe for those on the call, creative financing, this is something that can happen at the municipal level with municipalities that can offer PACE programs that allow you to make upgrades to your home that's financed to municipal bills, banks that offer zero interest loans. And then maybe on the even more popular than incentives was really just bringing down that upfront price. And so there are tools available in public policy to do that. So the EV availability standard which is the policy that requires automakers to make a certain number of vehicles available over time, has been estimated to lower the price point of EVs in Canada by up to 20%. And that's because if automakers need to sell more electric vehicles to people, they have been known to bring more electric vehicles in at different price points to offer to the market. And the other piece, just improving competition and looking at what could you do to bring in your EVs from other markets. So next slide, Trevor. We actually put out just a subsequent mini report on this topic, really trying to elaborate on the point that upfront cost in some ways can be kind of a Canada challenge. It's not that it's insurmountable, but when you look at electric vehicles selling for under the $40,000 price point, and currently in Canada, we have one, whereas in Europe, they have 21. And maybe contrary to what might be a general conception, these are not all from Chinese automakers. These are coming from European, South Korean automakers. And so, how are we sparking that competition in our own market to make sure that those people who are inclined to get an electric vehicle, but who just don't see themselves in a current price point, would be able to do so? And so, in the top graphic here, you'd see you can catch about half of the population around a $40,000 price point. And so for us, that's really become a bit of a driver of public policy. How can we get these things into the hands of people at a price they can afford? Next slide, please, Trevor. Barrier 2, housing type. So you'll notice I put up a nice picture of a house at the beginning, and it was a single family home where one person owns it and they get to make all the decisions. It gets more complicated as soon as you live in a condo and you're asking your condo board for permission to do these things, or a renter where they may very well want to save on a monthly energy bills, but the person who has to pay to make the renovations is the landlord. So I would say the solutions here become a bit more systemic. So like, how are we making building code changes so new builds don't address this problem in the future? Are there energy efficiency standards that governments can set to ensure that landlords are required to set a certain amount of energy efficiency for apartments? And then solving the buildings we already have, government supports in terms of financing money, or right to charge. So, if I live in a condo, am I able to install charging if I want to? Next slide, Trevor. So this is just demonstrating, I think where your housing situation is really going to impact whether you see yourself in some of these technologies. And if you live in a townhome or a condo, or you're a renter, it's definitely across the board sort of reducing people's interest, probably because it's hard for them to imagine being able to do some of these things. Next slide. Now, what I find exciting about this one is, well, the first two issues, like there's a lot of public policy questions here. Everyone on this call can help solve number 3, which is knowledge gaps. And so this was across the board from those questions, like if I was really concerned about, almost the same number of people were concerned about the cost of replacing an EV battery as they were concerned about the upfront cost. And so probably a vast majority of them don't know that you have an 8-year warranty to 160,000 kilometers in Canada, and that might help quell their fear. But it got even more exciting about heat pumps. And I know Drew will dig into this later. Half of Canadians were aware of key facts around heat pumps. So, it gets confusing because they're heat pumps, but they also cool. So really increasing exposure to these key facts changed intention much more than even for an electric vehicle, where some of these views were really already more formed. So lots of great initiatives here. Plug and Drive Cara is here to talk about hers. And I think, anything that our organizations, municipalities, media outlets can do to help ensure people are receiving some of this information accurately is critical. Next slide. Kind of rounding out the high level concerns is this idea around electricity and infrastructure. And it's true, this one really does depend on housing. And so not only your housing situation, but your current house. And I think there's, again, kind of buckets of what we can do here. One of them is, are we right sizing solutions? So does someone actually need to change their whole panel, or based on their driving habits, could they get away with just plugging their electric vehicle into a wall plug? Of course, building for future to make sure we're avoiding this problem from the get-go is critical. And then those kinds of investment and monetary programs to make sure we're helping to change current buildings. Thanks, Trevor. Next slide. So just finishing up here on our key findings. I mean, one takeaway for everyone is people were really interested. I know this was the kind of metro city areas, but it was urban, suburban, across the board. We were really looking at a like quite diverse population with diverse views that still had a lot of openness to these technologies. So when we're saying who are the likely adopters or the possible future ones, it's really great to know there isn't a lack of interest. It's really that there are some real barriers. Exciting to see younger respondents a lot more inclined. And so people who might never get behind the wheel of a fossil fuel vehicle who want to drive an EV for their first car. And finally, while helping educate and simplify for maybe people who own their own home and find it complicated. Next slide, Trevor. We've talked about both of these ones, so I think I'll skip on to the final one slide. Yeah, and so I think we said right off at the top, this isn't, there's a lot we can do to help raise awareness of key facts and help build that network effect and amplifying. And maybe critical for our discussion and this very final point, number 9, I think when we often think about these solutions, we believe we're communicating to people about climate change, but we actually had groups that were much less interested in lowering their carbon footprint, who were more interested in some of these clean technologies. So I think that really needs to frame how we think about them and how do we send the right message to the right group about the benefits of these different pieces. And with that, I'm really looking forward to our discussion, and I'll hand it back over to Amber.
Thank you, Rachel. It's super interesting as somebody who is having conversations about, are we talking about climate? Are we not talking about climate? Who are we talking to? What are we talking to them about? I feel like this piece of research has given us kind of a roadmap around what are the choices available? Who are the people who are interested? How do we reach them? So yeah, just grateful for the work that you've done. We are now going to open it up into a panel discussion. So there were a couple of questions already coming through in the Q&A, so I would encourage people to continue to ask questions, and we will open it up in about 15 minutes or so, and we'll get to some of those specific questions. But for right now, I'm happy that Cara and Drew are joining us, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how this conversation is playing out on the front lines. So for the people who are really in and working with the public and governments and communities. So question for you, Cara, to open it up. You're seeing firsthand what people are thinking when they come in for a test drive. So just curious, what are you hearing from consumers? What are the concerns that you're hearing? And how's your team talking them through that? And how are you approaching the conversation?
Thanks, Amber. I'm actually, it's really fascinating to see the results that Clean Energy Canada got, because they're very similar to what we hear from people every day. We hear cost, number 1 concern, and range is number 2, almost always. And environment or concern about the environment usually ranks somewhere below those, sometimes well below those. And so what we have done is we really talk a lot more now about the savings and other benefits that you get from EVs, and look, they're also great for the environment. So we it's a sort of a plus benefit. We have a great tool on our website that you can calculate your savings, and it's really easy to use. So, and people, one of the challenges we've had in explaining the savings to consumers is that they usually are not used to going in to a dealership and doing any math. All cars used gas, and yeah, maybe some were a little bit more efficient than others, but the difference was not what it is now. The difference now is can be 8 to 1, 10 to 1. Like I'm on Ontario's ultra low price for electricity. It's 2.8 cents. It cost me 50 cents to fill up my EV overnight. And so it's about 1/10 the cost of gas, and that would probably be a generous and conservative example. So the savings are really there, And it's just a matter of explaining to consumers, and also this whole issue that Rachel and Trevor pointed out, the pay now to save later kind of conundrum. And a lot of folks can't pay now to save later. And that's where creative financing or leasing can really help. And someone in the Q&A did point out, what about used? And that's really important to remind people that used EVs are actually a fantastic option and they are affordable. I agree with Clean Energy Canada. It would be great to get some lower priced EVs. And it's great to remind people that the lower priced EVs are available if you're someone who's open to a used vehicle.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And Cara, just curious, do you have, for the communicators here, we're often talking about messengers. So I'm curious what you think in terms of where people are getting their information, and who do they want to hear from? Who is it that I know that Plug and Drive is very active in the space. Who else do you think would be a powerful, communicator around this?
Right. I mean, what we hear from people is they love hearing from us and other, I think, NGOs, because they really do trust that our information is unbiased and we're not trying to sell a car or anything. And so they will believe that information. I think sometimes there's a challenge with the automaker information, even if it is accurate. I think people don't necessarily trust it. And that's been one of the things we hear from consumers, is that they love coming to us with with their questions. We can help them and also look at all the different brands, and we're not, pushing any particular agenda, and then they can go and make the choice themselves. And so we have found that to be effective. I mean, I think people do trust the government's information as well, but they're kind of drowned out right now with all the noise, a lot of it coming from the US with the misinformation. And so, it's hard to, combat that. What can I say? It's that's a big mouthpiece, and it's challenging to try to rise above that. All we can do is keep on beating the drum, right? Like all of us are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think back to Rachel's point around the need for amplification around key facts and figures.
Yeah.
And I think Trevor also pointed out in the research itself that people are looking to friends and family,
Yes,
and their
that's true.
experiences.
And you'll
With the
see, I mean, their research showed, like, people are interested in what their friends do. And if you look at a map of where the EVs are, you'll also see that they do cluster in neighborhoods, which is partly because of infrastructure and other reasons, but it's also the neighborhood effect or neighbor effect, which is like, I was the first one in my neighborhood in 2011, but now my neighborhood is full of EVs. And I wouldn't say it's all like due to me, but it's like they see them and then they feel more comfortable,
Yeah.
It's the same at a workplace. They say actually a workplace, studies are showing that if your colleagues are getting EVs, that's even more powerful than your next door neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, important, that kind of social norms, and people like
Yes.
me are doing it, therefore, people
Right.
like me should do it. Yeah. Drew, yeah, so I think that the general sense is that we underestimate kind of how tough HVAC work is, and it's long hours, and it's kind of complex, and there's a real kind of cost competitive aspect to it. On the same time, installers, I can't tell you how many times I have heard people tell stories about, asking installers for information and looking to them as a key point of contact for homeowners. So again, we've got a lot of communicators here on this call, campaigners. And what do you think that we can do to support contractors and installers and kind of people on the front line with messages around some of the home energy technologies that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think so. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and it fits pretty neatly into the conversation that we're having today about the different segments. And I think it's just important to understand that your traditional HVAC contractor, the average HVAC contractor certainly isn't in those first two categories.
Right.
And HVAC, like HVAC is a race to the bottom. The most common buying factor for a homeowner is the price of the equipment. So when we're talking to contractors, I think it's just important to understand the reality of what it's like on the ground as a contractor, and that is that contractors, the majority of contractors are small businesses. It's fewer than 5 people. It's fewer than 10 people. The owner of the business is a technician, and they're wearing 5 different hats in the company. They're doing the admin, they're answering the phone, and they're on the tools doing the work. So they are overworked, and they don't have time to think about these big picture issues that we're talking about. Another thing is that HVAC is almost always replaced in an emergency, right? Like 90% of HVAC gets replaced when it's February and the furnace breaks, so the homeowner just needs a new furnace, and they call whatever HVAC company they've used before shows up on Google Maps. So there's difficulty there in having longer conversations with homeowners and digging deeper with them when it's an emergency and they just need heating or they just need cooling. With HVAC contractors being small businesses, there's also an inherent risk to asking that contractor to slow down and think about different business models or installing different equipment. Like they are living project to project. They need to win jobs to get enough revenue to stay open, right? And so there isn't that space to explore and tinker and try out a heat pump and see if it works, or change their sales process and see if that works. They are just, the majority of them are just trying to survive. And the big thing that I think really resonates with this report is that stereotypically, I suppose, contractors are more conservative, both big C and little c conservative. And so the climate angle isn't important to them. And we see this even harsher in the States, where it's actually so politicized there that heat pumps are, it's hard to get anybody to listen about heat pumps at all, because it's now associated as a climate solution. And therefore, like the divide there is so big in the States that once you're on one side, once an issue gets on one side or a product gets on one side, the other side won't even touch it, right? And so contractors are more conservative. And so when we talk to them, we need to just have those realities in mind. We have to not, like, there's a truism in sales that someone's not going to buy what you want to sell, right? You need to sell what they want to buy. And that applies to contractors here, where we are trying to sell them. We are pitching them heat pumps and electrification, but we're pitching them those things in sort of surrounded by climate, right? And that's the wrong thing.
What is the right way to frame it from your perspective?
So from what I've seen, it's a conversation about how heat pumps are an opportunity for contractors to solve problems that matter to homeowners, right? And by doing that, they can add more value to the homeowner, which means charging higher prices. Charging higher prices means they can work fewer jobs and sort of get ahead of the way, like get unburied in the overwork that they're in. So I think it's the business case for contractors to pitch this. And part of that is the pitch to contractors. And then the step after that is showing them or helping them with the pitch to homeowners, right? Because we need contractors to profitably sell heat pumps and then do high quality installations on those heat pumps, because none of this works if homeowners have bad experiences with heat pumps because of bad installations. And it also doesn't work if contractors are doing this work but they're not profitable, right? Then they will just stop doing it. And that's sort of what we saw with Canada Greener Homes with the rebates, where the rebates were big enough where every contractor got on board because there was just so much extra demand and so much extra money in it that suddenly they were all pro heat pumps. And then when it disappeared, it wasn't sticky at all, right? All of those contractors went straight back to the old messaging of heat pumps don't work, because it didn't fit their business model anymore to sell heat pumps.
Mhm. So I guess that kind of relates back to some of the points that Trevor and Rachel made around the need for kind of a broader amplifier of messaging around the business case for this, how homeowners are doing it, and some support for contractors to identify which types of homeowners are most likely. And then I really take your point around kind of when are we having that conversation with people, because people will be doing research at the last minute in an emergency. And so we need to get to them sooner. So Drew, we'll come back to you, but I thought that the mention of the Greener Homes program was a good lead in. Rachel, I think in the last number of months, we've seen a lot of uncertainty, both, from consumers, but also from, some of the levels of government that are offering these programs that make it easier for people. For the folks who are on this call, what can we do? And this is also a question that Patricia Lane asks in the Q&A here. And she says, subsidies have been clunky and in many cases hard to access and insufficient, but I understand have helped a lot. In a time of fiscal constraint, austerity even, how can we persuade governments to increase them and make them more available?
So I think your question is very timely, Amber, because yes, right now the federal government, they ran out of money in their EV rebate program and have not re-upped it, but have signaled more incentives are coming. BC has paused their rebates. Quebec paused their rebates and then brought them back again. And it's creating this real distortion in the market where, of course, if you're thinking about an EV and someone's telling you maybe you'll get some money off later, you might wait to purchase. So I think it's a timely moment for people who care about these issues to be out and talking to governments about why they're important. The Canada Greener Homes Loan also just kind of announced that they're going to close applications as of October 1st based on financing. Yes, I think some of these programs could come back and be revamped and be thinking a little bit more about how to make these things more accessible and easier for people. But at the base of it, 3/4 of people we surveyed said governments should help people access clean technologies, and that was across demographics. So if governments are thinking this is a program that's just benefiting, people who could afford to do this anyways, I think some of the segmentation shows these are families who are looking to save on their energy bills. These are actually affordability measures, and so it's just like a timely moment to be out and sending that message to governments about why this is important and why people want them. And then two, though, I think let's also not be the messengers of the harbingers of doom a little bit. There are some great heat pump programs offered by provinces. And so making sure that you're well informed in your area about some of the services that are available, and happy to, we did a provincial scorecard a couple of years ago, but there's other resources out there as well to just make sure we are sharing with friends and neighbors that these kinds of support systems exist. Because some of the problem is also that people don't know that they, would have their mind changed, but they wouldn't know. So I think those two things, Amber, might be really helpful for people on this call.
Yeah, thank you. Trevor, just kind of following up from that, I know that people often find examples really helpful. So communities that are doing it well, organizations that are doing it well. And so I'm just curious as a comms guy, have you seen, something that's following best practice that you think aligns well with the research, either in, kind of back to what Drew was talking about around supporting contractors, or that more community public facing example?
Sure, yeah. And just to lead into this question, because the network effect came up. And yeah, that's really important. So we actually tested that. And what we found was that 73% of the people in the survey who knew someone, 73% of people were likely to get an EV if they knew someone who had an EV, versus 59% of the total folks. And really interesting is we saw no difference in their political alignment. So somebody was an NDP voter, or a conservative voter, or a liberal voter, they were basically just as likely to have been in an EV. And to know someone who drives an EV. So I think that's really interesting. And this actually experiencing things firsthand really matters. And I think that EVs are actually less political than you might think, at least in these metro regions. And a lot of what we think is the political division is actually a regional division. But, you know, under the question of like, yeah, so how do we create those tangible experiences when we're not necessarily their friends? You know, I think obviously we have, you know, Drew and Cara are on this webinar because they're exemplars of exactly that, right? And I think there are some great events as well. Like I know Everything in Electric gets people really jazzed up in Vancouver. There are tons of, you know, EVs and electric technologies in the convention center, and like it's very well attended. I actually hear people talking about it. People I don't even assume as being invested in this actually excited about that event. And then I think there's things that governments can do. So there's the BC government has a home energy planner that actually sort of helps people get specific information on their house and figure out what kind of upgrades might make sense for them. Because people do need, you know, ways to walk through this. And, you know, I would love to see something similar from other governments, from the federal government. You know, and the last thing I'll say, and maybe I say this because I used to be a good journalist, but like good journalism is really important. And it's going to be really important for the next decade. You know, we do have a few good, like really solid specialized reporters who report on this stuff really well. But oftentimes it's just it's not particularly well reported and not conveying the information that we need. So I think that I think that's going to be really critical. And just high level, I think we've you know, for a lot of us in this call, we've thought about how do we like empower and activate climate activists. And I think what I would say is I think we're now in the decade of the clean technology adopter. And that's a different kind of person. And they're not always coming at it from a climate perspective. And so we need to think about how do we activate them and not assume that they're, you know, that the Venn diagram is a circle, because it's not.
Excellent. Cara, sorry if you were going to respond to Trevor or Rachel, but I'll come back to you.
I
and then we'll
wanted
move on
to, it works with either, but I was going to just add on to Rachel because she made some really good points, and we do have on our website like a listing of all the rebates you can get on EVs, but one that I just want to make people aware of, there's a bunch of provincial level rebates, but there's also a federal rebate that still exists. And for whatever reason, it's very poorly known about. And it's actually a tax credit. It's not a rebate in hand. So that's probably why it doesn't get a lot of play. But it's available to anyone with a small business, or even like a one-person business. And you can get quite a significant tax break on an EV. And it's actually more valuable than the $5,000 that you could have got, but you can't get both. You have to choose, and the dealers don't know about it, so they don't tell people that, oh, if you're a small business, you'd be better off getting the incentive on the tax side than you are taking the cash in hand. So I just wanted to make sure people knew about that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so for some of you who may have not caught the beginning of the webinar, we are on for 75 minutes. And so we do have about 15 minutes now to talk about and answer your questions. Again, we'll be using the Q&A to sort through those and identify questions. We do ask people when you register if you have any questions for the panelists. And so we did get a few of those, and we'll kick off with one. Curious, and this is, I'm going to just open it up for all of you. Your study has really focused in on the GTA and on Vancouver. What would you say about the people who live outside of dense urban environments? So what's the conversation for those of you who are not in a major urban center? Cara, you're on screen, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay, sure. So look, I think it's really important to remember that EVs make sense depending on how much you drive. And it's really more important to think about how your driving distance than whether you live in a city or you live in the country. I actually have a place in the country, and so I have a long drive, and you know, I'm an EV driver and I don't have a gas car. But so what I would say is the stats will tell you 80% of Canadians drive 50 kilometers or less a day. So if you happen to be one of those types of commuters, an EV is going to work great for you, whether it's rural or urban or whatever. If you're someone who drives 400 kilometers a day, well, you're going to have to think twice about whether you can get a charge where you're headed. And it's a much harder decision to make. So it's really more about the distance that I would say rural versus urban. People definitely overplay the importance of infrastructure in their daily commute. Chances are, unless you have a really long commute, you're not going to be using public infrastructure except on a road trip. And so think about, if you're going to charge at home, you think about your distance. If you have charging at work, you're going to think about the distance just one way at work.
Yeah, maybe Drew, similar question for you. What's your sense of how this conversation is different between rural areas and urban areas, and any advice for the people on this call?
Yeah, it's I would highlight what Rachel alluded to earlier, which is the difference between East Coast and where I am in Ontario. And that can be a similar conversation about what the reality in Toronto versus the reality in Northern Ontario, or just anywhere off the 401. And the piece that I would point to for that is that it's different fuels are used for heating. Right. So in Toronto, basically everything is heated by gas. So it's a very different conversation for homeowners switching from a gas furnace to a heat pump than it is to somebody on an oil furnace switching to a heat pump. They get all of the sort of comfort, health, and safety benefits of a heat pump in either case, but there's going to be huge dollar savings if you're switching from those higher cost fuels. And that's what we see a lot in the East Coast, and that's why the heat pump market in the East Coast is more mature, because there's been that economic benefit of making that switch on top of the other benefits. Yeah, that's the biggest thing that I would highlight, and that goes back to having different conversations with different homeowners, and yeah, so it's just that changes by province, and that changes by sort of city versus rural, or urban versus rural as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move over to some of the questions that are coming in from people on the call here. To Rachel or Trevor, from Karen, what suggestions do you have for how we can push the CSA approval of technologies like balcony solar and meter collars? Canadians cannot adopt what they cannot buy.
Yeah, I would say in general, some of our policy solutions tended to be more focused towards the EVs and the heat pumps in the way that I explained at the beginning. These are a bit of leading technologies. It is unfortunate in Canada when you travel to other countries and you see the vast proliferation of rooftop solar, that it's something that just really is very early market here in Canada. So I suppose I would say, I think we are working on projects to try to work with utilities and provinces to change the market design. Like, you can't benefit from these things in a lot of provinces yet, which would change how many people want to install them. It's complex, but definitely stay tuned on our website, and we'll have other updates more technically around some of that work as it comes out. But I definitely acknowledge that this is sort of the first part of our household's work, and probably things like smart meters, thermostats, rooftop solar, probably lots more to dig into in detail in those in the future.
Great, thank you. I have one here from Sandra to Trevor. In an information environment rife with misinformation, what kinds of storytelling or framing can actually break through? And why aren't we talking more openly about these bad faith actors and their tactics? I'm going to go to Trevor first, high level, and then I'd love to hear from Cara and Drew on what you're saying on the ground to like real people. Yeah, Trevor. So just once again, any information, a lot of misinformation, what kinds of storytelling or framing can actually break through, and why aren't we calling out bad faith actors?
Well, I think anyone who works in communications has probably heard some version of the mantra of like, don't repeat your opponent's argument, and then only get around to making your point when like the clock's ticking out and you get 20 seconds left. I think it is really important that, like, in this awful misinformation age that we live in, to not be in our opponent's field. I think that we definitely need to find frames that make this, to use that are the cliche we use, a sword issue as opposed to a shield issue. Like the fact is that, like, you know, especially in these key metro regions, like the majorities are on our side on this, right? And so don't assume you're coming from a place of weakness when you're actually coming from a place of strength. And, you know, try to come up with arguments that are actually putting your opponents on their heels. I mean, we've been really focused on the need to get electric cars under $40,000 because all of our research shows this is the case. We've talked about lowering the tariff on Chinese EVs because even though that's, you know, I could say it's contentious because it obviously upsets some people, but we know that 8 in 10 Canadians actually support lowering or removing that tariff on Chinese EVs. So like know where your strength actually lies and really lean into that. I think that is the key to success here.
Yeah. So there's lots of interest. 3/4 of Canadians want the government to make it easier for them. And then I think the point that we often talk about too, about this, we're often positioning, or bad faith actors are positioning this stuff as fringe, when in fact it is mainstream, will be increasingly mainstream. And, you know, you can just point to certain neighborhoods, friends, family, opening markets, et cetera, around the business case. Cara, I'll go over to you.
Sure.
So, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
same
look,
question.
it's a challenge, right? Because there's two philosophies I think that we try to follow. Is first, we want to meet people where they are. And so we try to talk about things that are relevant to them based on the questions that they ask. And we don't get that much naysaying at our events. Maybe people who are coming to test drive a car are already, you know, somewhat on board or at least curious. But the other thing is, I would say about that is, you know, to quote Michelle Obama, just, you know, when they go low, we go high. Like I try not to go there because it does get you kind of into a negative talking point, and it just doesn't help, I don't find. So I just generally try to stay away from that and try to just talk facts. Like especially if someone says, well, I've heard that, you're gonna have to replace the battery and that's gonna cost you 10 grand. And it's like, oh, well, you know, the studies show actually nobody is replacing their battery. And I have a whole bunch of studies that show actually the battery will probably outlast the car. So just hit fact with fact, you know, like that's an alternative fact that doesn't really exist. So you usually can have a real fact that can combat it.
And I'd also point out, Cara, that your opening remarks around it cost you 50 cents to fill up your vehicle.
That's just a
And that's
fact.
personal experience, and that's your
Yes.
story. And you have,
Yes.
you know, 15 years of EV ownership as a
Yeah.
really powerful story for people.
Yes, exactly. That it is effective, and that's why people love to hear from their neighbors and friends, right? That what Trevor and Rachel mentioned is that those are people they trust, and so they're not necessarily going to be skeptical of that information.
Yeah. Drew, and then we're going to kind of begin to wind down here. We've got a few minutes left. Drew, just curious, are there any stories that you're finding particularly effective when you're talking to contractors or homeowners around, heat pumps or other pieces?
Yeah, all of the stories, anecdotes, explanations that fall into that category, I added to my book. Like that. So my book is called Feel Good Homes, and I give away free copies of it, either hard copies or PDF copies of the book to anybody that wants it, just as a way to spread good, accurate information about heat pumps. And so if you're looking for more detail about the homeowner education process that I would go through with any homeowner, I would just go and get a free copy of that book and read it, because I pitched that book for a homeowner as a 2-hour consultation with me, and it would be everything that I could explain to you about how your house works and the benefits of heat pumps. And so I think that's the easiest way for me to pass that information on to anyone on this call.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask you each for your one key takeaway. But before that, I'll do one last question. To Drew, Cara, from Melissa, do you think we should also focus on the health benefits of EVs or heat pumps as well as the cost benefits? So kind of once again, in real life, are you talking about the health benefits and is it effective, or is it just really all about cost? Cara, you're on
Sure.
mute.
We do talk about it. I would say it's usually, again, secondary to cost. Because our research shows that's the number one concern people have. But I do think it's kind of an overlooked point, and we do try to make it. Again, we try to respond in person to what people are asking about. But if I'm making a presentation or something, I will always include something about that. Since we all do breathe, it's a helpful one for certain audiences. I hate to say that for some, they don't care about that, which is surprising, but true.
Yeah. Drew, how much would you emphasize health over cost?
Yeah, I would highlight just the last sentence there, that some homeowners don't care about it. And so it goes back to, it depends on what the values, what the goals are of the homeowner. For some homeowners, that will be the biggest buying factor for them, and it's hugely important to get that. And for other ones, it might not even be on the list. I think it's something that applies to sort of electrification across the board, and it's something that we've seen success with campaigning around for induction cooking, right?
Yeah.
Around the asthma rates in kids that grow up in houses with gas stoves, right? There's all of that messaging that I think is very effective. But it depends on the homeowner.
All right. Well, Trevor, as the person who waded through the crosstabs on the segmentation, I'll ask you the same question, health versus cost, and then we'll just roll right into your key takeaway, and then I'll move to others. So did that come up, and what's your opinion?
Yeah, we didn't dig too much into health on this one versus cost, but I do think that's definitely an area that's worth exploring more. And I think, especially in the GTHA where we're seeing, heat pumps more in the break-even territory with natural gas furnaces after the removal of the carbon tax, that those like other benefits like health, like nicer, more even heat are the things that are actually going to push the heat pump over the line. So I think it's definitely an area of study and one honestly we could probably do more work on. As for sort of my big takeaway, I'm pivoting into that now. I think part of this research that for us, the big takeaway and what we want to convey is that like it's really tempting to talk about that hardest person to convince. Yeah, okay, but how do we convince this like retired guy in rural Alberta who's voted conservative his entire life to get an electric vehicle? And like, I'm not saying I don't care about that, but there's so many people who are open to getting an electric vehicle right now who feel they can't do it, and that's who I care about, right? Because
Okay.
like there's a huge gap between the number of people that are adopting EVs today or heat pumps or these other clean technologies and the number of people who say that they're keen to get it or even just vaguely open to get it, right? That's a huge wide open field, and there are a lot of barriers and reasons why they're not able to do that. I'm especially interested in younger people because they're so keen on going electric, but I know that housing is a real big barrier for them doing so. And that doesn't just take communications, it also takes policy solutions. So these things do need to go hand in hand. So I guess that's my key message. Let's really focus on empowering the people who want to do this and just need a couple tweaks to make it so.
All right. Okay, Rachel, 30 seconds.
Plus one on Trevor. And then listening to Drew and Cara, I would just say there are people out there for whom this makes sense. Maybe it's like people in the East Coast who have oil heating. They need a heat pump. They have electric baseboards. Makes sense for them. They drive a long commute. Makes sense for them. So maybe avoiding thinking that, people who live in cities who care about climate are the audience. It's like, let's think about why these things make sense for different demographics and go out and talk to them about why it makes sense for them.
Great. Cara, 30 seconds.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my favorite topic, which is used EVs. And I would love to see more focus on used and some policy levers around used, because many Canadians never buy a new car and it's affordable, available. You know, there's so many reasons why we should be encouraging it. And so I would say that. And also, let's not just look to the government for rebates or incentives. There's lots of other ways to get incentives, like your employer, for example, who rebates you on all kinds of healthcare and other things. Why not putting their
Okay.
money where their mouth is for EVs?
Okay, Drew, 30 seconds, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, I think it's just understanding and thinking about what an individual person and homeowner or a contractor is, what are their values, right? What is going to be a selling point for them, and that takes being curious and asking questions. And so that's the message that I would leave everybody with, is that we need to sort of figure out what that benefit is and then push that as the selling point.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you all. Grateful to Clean Energy Canada for this really important and actionable piece of research. I feel like we have a much clearer sense of where to push on the open doors and what to talk to them about and how to reach them. We will be coming back with another piece of work looking at how are we empowering people who have taken and adopted EVs or home energy technologies, heat pumps, etc. So watch that space. We'll have some really detailed guidance. We're in the middle of a pilot project as it is now. Just to say, we've recorded this session. We will share that with you. We will share the presentation. We'll also share some of the resources that have been kind of floating by here in the chat. We have popped in a link to a valuation survey for your feedback. It's always critical. Nice to know kind of what you're interested in. Does this resonate? Would you like more of it? And for those of you who do not yet follow Re.Climate, please do so. You can sign up to receive information from us, blogs, similar kinds of events at reclimate.ca. And if you have any questions about this or other things, then you can reach out to our colleague, Emma, who has been busy working behind the scenes. And you can reach her at emma@reclimate.ca, and we're happy to answer and follow up with you directly. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the work that you do. And everyone, have a good day, and you'll hear from us very shortly. Thank you.